No political backstabbing and betrayal should be allowed to tarnish his lifelong goal. As the dawn broke and the call for prayer was announced from the minarets of the Grand Mosque of Cairo, Saladin could finally make up his mind. He decided to wait and not get involved in the political turmoil in Syria for the time being. His lifelong mission for the Holy Lands was put on pause. A few days later, a messenger reached Damascus with a letter from Saladin to Saleh. The Sultan of Egypt had promised full support to the young prince and would always come to his aid whenever it was needed. As Saladin's letter reached Damascus, another message reached Saladin's court in Cairo. Egypt was under attack. A naval fleet of crusaders and Sicilians laid siege on Alexandria, one of the most important cities in Egypt. The attackers had almost 200 warships, 40 transport ships, and more than 1,000 knights. It was a formidable assault. But this time, Saladin was much more prepared than on previous occasions. Soldiers and supplies were quickly sent to Alexandria to reinforce the defenders. The initial blow was heavy on the Muslims. All the warships and commercial vessels of the Muslims at the port of Alexandria were destroyed by the Sicilian invaders. But as the reinforcements reached the city, the defenders' morale was boosted. On the second day of the battle, when the invaders brought their siege towers near the wall of Alexandria, the Muslim defenders burst out of the gates in a surprise attack and did their best to hit the enemy's morale. They burnt down the siege towers, ravaged the enemy camps, and took away large amounts of weaponry and treasure. This was a serious blow to the invaders. As the siege dragged on for days, the invaders started to lose strength. They needed reinforcement, but the promised reinforcements never arrived from the Crusader states. That was because King Amalric died suddenly of dysentery in Jerusalem. His kingdom was passed on to his 13-year-old son, Baldwin IV, who was suffering from leprosy. This sudden death of Amalric prevented the Crusaders from sending the promised supplies to the battlefield. Ever the diplomat, Saladin quickly initiated a truce between him and the new Crusader king, leaving the Sicilians alone to fight in the battle. Simultaneously, Saladin started marching towards Alexandria with a huge army. The Sicilians had to accept the defeat. What could have been the biggest threat to Saladin's reign actually brought yet another victory through his military and diplomatic prowess. But all the news was not good. Back in Syria, the young prince Saleh became a pawn in the fighting among top Zengid leaders. The prince was in Aleppo, and the emir of Aleppo, Gumushtigin, wanted to use his guardianship over the prince to establish his own political influence in Syria and kill the other emirs in the region, starting with Damascus. A political rival of the emir of Aleppo was Saif al-Din, the emir of Mosul, but he refused to come to the aid of Damascus when requested. So seeing no other way, the emir of Damascus had to ask support from Saladin. This request gave Saladin the legitimacy to get involved in the power struggle in Syria. But Saladin had to act quickly. There was no time to assemble a large army and spend several weeks marching towards Syria. He took 700 of his best horsemen and rushed towards Damascus. To save time, he even went through Crusader territories, Karak and Shubak. Although a very risky maneuver, it proved fruitful. Saladin traveled so quickly through the enemy territory that the Crusaders could not do anything about it. In the end, Saladin reached Damascus even before Gumushtigin's army started marching on the city. This was a brilliant move by Saladin, as Damascus now came under his control without any serious resistance. It saved plenty of time, resources, and bloodshed. The people of Damascus welcomed Saladin with open arms as their protector. After establishing his base in Damascus over the next few days and gathering more local force, Saladin quickly moved towards Aleppo, laid siege on the city, and demanded the guardianship of the Prince Saleh. One dark night during the siege of Aleppo, while Saladin was discussing plans with his emirs in a private tent, someone rushed into the tent from the darkness. He was dressed in black and had a bare knife at his hand. He jumped onto Saladin in an attempt to stab him with the knife. This was Saladin's first encounter with the secret cult called the Assassins. So far, we have seen Saladin rise in power and win one victory after another. As we further explore the events of his life, we'll see a new chapter unfold, a chapter full of struggles, stalemates, and challenges, a period in which Saladin spends most of his time and effort fighting his fellow Muslims rather than the Crusaders. Saladin Part 4, Pitfalls in Syria. Aleppo, Syria, 1175. As the morning sun rose, Saladin looked at the walled city of Aleppo from a nearby hill. The attack by the assassins on his life the night before had left him perplexed. He had underestimated the shrewdness of Gumushtigin. Saladin could not imagine that Gumushtigin would hire assassins to kill him. The assassins were a secret group fortifying themselves in the dense mountains of Syria, and they were famous for targeted killings of political personnel of high power in both the Muslim and Crusader ranks. Ideologically, they followed the Shia sect, and thus they did not like Saladin for abolishing the Fatimid Caliphate. So it was very easy for Gumushtigin to convince the assassins' leader, Rashid ad-Din Sinan, to attack Saladin. On top of that, more news had recently come to Saladin that the Crusaders, under the command of Raymond of Tripoli, were gathering forces and raiding the borders of Saladin's Syrian territory. It was rumored that Gumushtigin had a hand in that as well. All the pieces of the puzzle were now falling into place. Saladin could see how treacherous Gumushtigin had been. He looked at the citadel of Aleppo. He realized how far away he was from gaining total control of Syria. The capture of Aleppo seemed like a dream now far away. Saladin had to respond immediately against the threat of the Crusaders. He couldn't risk his life and the loss of his army to continue the siege on a heavily fortified city like Aleppo. In this round, Gumushtigin had won. Saladin lifted the siege and took his army back to Damascus. From there, he sent forces to deter the raiding Crusaders. Saladin's recent momentum in Syria caused a lot of jealousy in the Zengid leadership. The emerging leader of the Zengids, Saif al-Din, was a cousin of Nur ad-Din. So he got the support of Prince as-Saleh and Gumushtigin. Saif al-Din soon united the quarreling Zengid emirs and solidified his position on a vast territory including Mosul and Aleppo. To weaken the position of Saladin in Syria, they launched a massive propaganda campaign stating that Saladin had forgotten his responsibility of freeing Jerusalem from the Crusaders. Saladin's reputation in Syria as a warrior of the Holy War was heavily damaged because of this. Saladin was under heavy pressure to take action, but his army was not yet strong enough to recapture Jerusalem, so he devised another plan. Saladin strengthened his forces in the cities of Horns and Hama in Syria, and from there he could launch skirmishes in the border territories of the Crusader states. These skirmishes were quite successful and in many cases drove Crusaders to withdraw. These victories worked as a checkmate for Saladin against the Zengid propaganda. Saladin's popularity soared among the Syrians as never before. In the following weeks, the political and territorial conflict between the Zengids and Ayyubids became so intensified that there was no way to avoid war. The armies met near Hama in March of 1175. Saladin was vastly outnumbered and had no intention of fighting his fellow Muslims. So Saladin proposed handing over Homs and Hama to the Zengids and in return asked acknowledgement as the ruler of Damascus on behalf of Princess Saleh. But the Zengids, led by Saif al-Din, were unmoved. Their reply was, surrender all lands in Syria and return to Egypt. The negotiation failed and the confrontation was unavoidable. Saladin's military skills and experiences had been greatly boosted by his recent military campaigns. This was reflected in how he arranged his forces to face the stronger opponent. He placed his army at the horns of Hama, hills by the gorge of the Orontes River. As soon as the Zengids attacked, they found themselves fighting the battle uphill and pinned by the river at one side. The Zengids' numerical advantage was nullified. Saladin launched a strong counterattack with his most veteran soldiers, immediately collapsing one wing of the Zengid army. Another wing followed shortly thereafter. The Zengids were surrounded from 3 sides and were thrashed. Another victory for Saladin. Through tactics and determination, Saladin would now be able to force the Zengids into a truce. The Zengids conceded that Saladin should keep his territories in Syria. But the prince would still be in Aleppo under Saif al-Din's guardianship. Finally, peace among the Muslims in Syria had begun. The victory against the Zengids was a crucial development in Saladin's political career. After the victory, Saladin was acknowledged by the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad as Sultan of Egypt and Syria. And as sovereign king, he no longer needed the patronage of the Zengid prince. Both in Cairo and in Damascus, coins were being minted with his official titles, and the Friday prayer sermon in the mosques, or khutbahs, started mentioning him as the sole ruler, omitting the name of a Saleh. This was a decisive move. Officially, Saladin was no longer a part of the Zengid dynasty. But his good fortune didn't last long. During the summer of 1175, a bad drought made the continuation of fighting with the Crusaders an impossibility. The Crusaders were also hit by the same situation, so they made peace with Saladin, and there was a pause on ongoing conflicts. Saladin could take a break from military campaigns and focus on the administration of his vast empire that included Egypt, Yemen, Hijaz, consisting of Mecca and Medina, and Syria. Hardly a year had passed. Political turmoil returned in Syria. Saif al-Din started looking for trouble in order to fight Saladin and to gain his territories. So Saladin gathered his forces and marched northwards from Damascus towards Aleppo. On the way, in a place called Tel al-Sultan, he encountered the army of Saif al-Din. Saladin's army was exhausted by their march, but the general lack of leadership and military skills amongst the Zengid leaders caused a delay in initiating the fight. This gave the Ayyubid army an unexpected opportunity to rest and regain their strength. When the fighting finally began the following day, battle-hardened Saladin took full advantage of the incompetence of the Zengid leaders. As soon as the wings of both armies met one another, Saladin charged forward at the center. The Zengid soldiers became panicked by this surprising maneuver and failed to keep their formation. The Zengids were decimated and Saif al-Din narrowly escaped. The whole Zengid war camp, including horses, armors, arms, and baggage trains, were captured by the Ayyubids. All the captured riches were distributed among the soldiers. Saladin kept nothing for himself, a custom that Saladin followed in every battle of his life. Saif al-Din fled to Aleppo. After the battle, Saladin moved north, capturing more towns in northern Syria from the Zengid command. Eventually, he reached Aleppo region and laid siege to the castle of Azaz, a formidable and strategically important site. One night during the siege, Saladin was having a discussion with his emirs inside his tent. A man dressed in black suddenly entered the tent and stabbed Saladin in the head with a knife. Fortunately, Saladin had been wearing a chainmail hood under his turban, and the first blow slipped and only cut his cheek. Saladin grabbed the man's knife hand and started to twist. The assassin tried to strike again at Saladin's neck. The strength and resistance of Saladin were enough to stop the assassin from landing a lethal blow. Still, the attacker's knife was able to cut through the leather armor on Saladin's shoulder and inflicted a wound. By this time, the emirs in the tent had fully realized what was going on and came forward to rescue their sultan. The assassin was struck down by them. While all of this was going on, a second and third assassin rushed into the tent and started attacking the emirs, but the chaos and screaming had alerted the guards. They came running and killed the assassins. Saladin's wounds were not severe, but he was profoundly shaken. He realized how serious of a threat the assassins had become. He immediately took precautions and raised guards around the camp to prevent any intruders from entering unnoticed. After a month of siege, the castle of Azaz fell. Now, Aleppo was completely surrounded. Saladin didn't want to launch a full-fledged attack and destroy the city. This would cause a lot of bloodshed on both sides, and Saladin didn't think it would be wise to prolong a campaign against his fellow Muslims unnecessarily. So when the Zengids in Aleppo offered a truce and proposed more territorial control to Saladin, he accepted their offer. The whole of northern Syria came under the Ayyubi dynasty except Aleppo. Now came time to settle scores with the assassins. Saladin launched a campaign into the territories occupied by the assassins. Soon he reached the castle of Masyaf, which belonged to the assassins' leader himself, Rashid ad-Din Sinan. Saladin laid siege to the castle. Day after day, Saladin sent his army to occupy the castle. Every time, the assassins resisted fiercely. The siege became long and bloody, but Saladin was relentless, wanting to see the end of it. So the fight continued. Finally, the assassins gave up and offered to make peace. Saladin now had two choices. He could either accept the peace or could continue the siege. The castle of Masyaf was a tough defensive site, fortified with walls and towers placed on top of a mountain. Continuing the capture of the castle would mean that Saladin would have to accept great losses and significantly weaken his army. This would give the Crusaders and the Zengids opportunities to make moves against him. After considering these factors, Saladin took the wiser route. He accepted the truce. A treaty was signed. Rashid ad-Din Sinan promised not to attack Saladin ever again and swore his allegiance. Although the assassins were not completely wiped out, Saladin still could neutralize the threat of the assassins. Saladin could turn an enemy into a strength, one less enemy to worry about. Finally, the situation in Syria was stable. The Zengids were no longer a threat. The assassins were under control, and the Crusaders had stopped their raids. Saladin now had a brief period of peace. He could finally focus on preparing for his ultimate goal, Jerusalem. He returned to Cairo, focused on fortification of his territories on different fronts, reorganized his army, and started planning a full-on offensive against the Crusaders to win back Jerusalem. After years of political struggle and bloodshed with his fellow Muslims, Saladin thought now he would be able to achieve his ultimate goal. Little did he know that he would soon have to flee the battlefield, narrowly escaping death. This was Saladin's first major campaign against the Crusaders, and it resulted in the most devastating defeat of his life at the Battle of Conqueror. Saladin Part 5. In failure, he learned to succeed. The 26th November, 1177. As the sun rose in the desert of the Sinai Peninsula, a small group of horsemen were moving at lightning speed towards Cairo. This group of horsemen consisted of Saladin and a handful of his bodyguards. Saladin himself rode in the middle of the group, his mind clouded with fury and embarrassment. He was thinking about the defeat he had endured just the afternoon before. He'd had all the advantages, and yet his mission failed. How could that be? How could he lose to the Crusaders? To understand Saladin's defeat at the Battle of Conqueror, we have to look a few weeks beforehand, when Saladin launched his campaign in early November of 1177. He had 18,000 soldiers plus 8,000 elite Mamluks. The Mamluks were highly trained, most skilled, and were the most enduring units of Saladin's army. They can be compared to the knights in European armies of the 12th century. Saladin's army was strong enough to face any army that the Crusader states could muster. Upon entering the Crusader territory, his army started raiding with the aim to cut the food supply to different Crusader strongholds. Saladin quickly passed the Crusader fortresses at Tarum and Gaza. He left a small garrison at each of these fortresses but did not engage in battle. Soon, the army reached Ascalon, a heavily fortified and strategically important Crusader city. Here, Saladin camped his main forces and sent some troops around to raid even deeper into the Crusader heartland to create panic and fear. However, he didn't lay siege on the city itself. It's a rare instance when Saladin left enemy strongholds unattacked behind his front line. First Daruma and Gaza, then later Ascalon. This would prove to be a costly mistake by Saladin in the coming days. Initially, Salahuddin's soldiers faced little to no resistance in their advancement. Some troops even reached Ramla, around 40 kilometers from Jerusalem. It seemed just a matter of time before Salahuddin would appear at the gates of Jerusalem with his army. This advancement by Salahuddin's army caused great panic among the Crusaders. King Baldwin IV called for every able man in his kingdom to bear arms and join the battle. Although suffering from leprosy, his health was stable enough for him to ride with his army to the battle. Answering his call, princes from the different crusading states joined his army. Among them was Reynold of Chatillon, Prince of Kerak, a name we would see returning frequently in future events. Now back to Baldwin IV's battle plan. He had to prove to his subjects that he was a capable king who would face the attackers and not simply let his kingdom be taken away. He decided not to wait until Salahuddin reached Jerusalem, rather to ride out and take the battle to Ascalon. This was a bold decision considering he only had 7,000 men to face off against Salahuddin's 26,000. But he had to reach Ascalon with his army, avoiding Salahuddin's raiding troops. If discovered before reaching Ascalon, he would not be able to defend his army. In an unfortunate turn of events, the scouts sent by Baldwin found that the Muslim troops spread out too thin to create a solid blockade at Ascalon. The groups were so far apart from each other that they would not be able to reassemble without significant delay. Seeing such gaps and a lack of discipline, the Crusaders took the opportunity and moved towards Ascalon through the gaps of the Muslim encirclement. Although late, the news reached Salahuddin before Baldwin IV's arrival in Ascalon. Yet, surprisingly, he decided not to engage this time as well. We cannot know for sure what was going on in Salahuddin's mind. Perhaps he thought he could pin down Baldwin in Ascalon without spending the strength of his army, and this way making it easier to capture Jerusalem without the king present. But before Salahuddin could put his plan into action, Baldwin IV surprised Salahuddin. On the afternoon of the 25th of November, 1177, Baldwin IV, with around 375 knights, heavily protected under metal armors and with strong horses, attacked Salahuddin's central camp near Ascalon. The rest of the army followed and smashed against the Muslim front line. Salahuddin realized the threat too late. Although he had sent orders to his scattered troops to gather, they could not reorganize quickly enough to put up a resistance. Salahuddin stepped back and tried to pull his forces on top of a hill called Montgisard. But the powerful charge by the Crusaders did its trick and Salahuddin's lines were broken. Salahuddin tried to rally his troops 2 times to counter the attack, but both attempts failed. The soldiers started to flee. The Crusader knights reached so close to Salahuddin that there were only a few elite Mamluk guards to protect the Sultan. By Salahuddin's own description of the events, a Templar knight came so close to him that he tried to hit Salahuddin on the chest with a lance. Luckily, 3 of Salahuddin's bodyguards were close enough and could come to his aid before the Sultan was injured. Salahuddin had to retreat. The whole Muslim camp, even Salahuddin's personal tent, was lost. Although Salahuddin could retreat safely, his army could not. Only a part of his force fought at Montgisard and were thrashed by the Crusaders. The other groups, who were spread out too far and were also attacked from all sides later on. Even while retreating, the fortresses that were left unattacked behind the front line became a constant source of attack and harassment for his soldiers. The defeat at Montgisard was a serious setback for Salahuddin's plan. No doubt he was sad and embarrassed, but the political consequences far outweighed any emotional damage. Salahuddin was now incredibly vulnerable. His kingdom was exposed both to the Crusaders and to his competitors in Syria. The morale of the Muslims was at the lowest it had been in decades. Meanwhile, the Crusaders were having victory parades showing off the spoils of battle. Salahuddin safely reached Cairo, and from there he started reorganizing. Now what we know about Salahuddin is that he was no quitter. He had surely learned many hard lessons in the aftermath of the Battle of Montgisard, and our guy Salahuddin was someone who learned from his mistakes. The next time, Salahuddin would be prepared for surprises. How much Salahuddin evolved as a leader after this event was obvious in the events that unfolded in the following months. The Crusaders, boosted in morale with their victory, launched attacks at strategically important cities in Syria such as Hama and Damascus. Some of the emirs in Syria also rebelled against Salahuddin, seeing his recent defeat. But Salahuddin was prudent and swift in his damage control. He soon moved back to Syria and from there coordinated his forces on multiple fronts. The rebellion was swiftly taken under control, although not completely quelled. Then there was a decisive victory of Saladin's forces in Hama that stopped the Crusader incursion. Saladin himself camped near Homs and engaged in skirmishes with the Crusaders. Saladin emerged victorious from these skirmishes and stalled the Crusaders from advancing. But Baldwin IV still did not give up. In an attempt to create pressure, he started building a castle at a place called Jacob's Ford. It was a real threat to the Muslims because of the location of the castle. Situated only 80 kilometers from Damascus, an army from Jacob's Ford could reach Damascus within a couple of days. It was also along the pilgrimage route, so the Crusaders could attack caravans making their way to Mecca for Hajj. Saladin decided to resolve this issue once and for all. He sent one of his generals, Farrukh Shah, to defend Damascus. While Baldwin IV advanced with his army towards Damascus, he expected almost no resistance. Instead, he met a formidable Muslim army and had to retreat after a humiliating defeat. Saladin regained his confidence and the trust of the Muslims. These victories were essential for Saladin at this crucial point. He could recover much of the military strength that was lost at the Battle of Montgisar. The morale of the Muslims was high again. He brought reinforcement from Egypt and completely pushed the Crusaders out of Syria. Saladin might have lost a battle, but he was still very much capable of fighting and winning the war. Saladin offered 100,000 pieces of gold to Baldwin IV to abandon the castle at Jacob's Ford, stating it would save lots of bloodshed on both sides. But his offer was refused. This was a clear provocation by the Crusaders. So Saladin launched a campaign again into the northern Crusader territories in 1179. This would be the first campaign that Saladin led himself since the Battle of Montgisar, almost 18 months prior. The Crusaders had to divide their forces from Jacob's Ford to answer Saladin's offense. This was his plan, to split the Crusader army, and it worked. The two armies met in a series of battles near Banyas, Sidon, and Beirut, which are part of modern-day Lebanon. This time, Saladin prevailed, and his army wiped out the Crusaders. These victories ensured bountiful food supply and riches for Saladin's troops, while the Crusader army was significantly weakened. A number of high-ranked Crusader knights were captured and taken prisoner. With a brilliant move, Saladin then decided to attack the Crusaders stationed at Jacob's Ford immediately. This surprise move by Saladin turned the battle into a race against time. It would take 5 to 6 days for reinforcements to arrive from Jerusalem to Jacob's Ford, so Saladin had to capture the castle within 5 days to avoid a long and devastating siege. So the Muslims attacked the castle with their full might. Day 1. The outer defensive works were captured by the Muslims, but the 4-meter-thick main wall of the castle still held them back. Day 2. The wall was bombarded with siege weapons for hours. The wall still stood high. In a desperate attempt, the Muslims tried to overrun the wall with ladders, but they failed. Saladin became even more desperate. He commanded his men to start digging a tunnel to go underneath the wall. The idea was to put explosives underneath the wall and blow the whole thing up from underground. Day 3. The attacks continued, but the wall stood strong. Meanwhile, the digging of the tunnel continued. Day 4. The tunnel was finally done. The order was given to set the explosives. The Muslims waited in anticipation for the explosion and the subsequent collapse of the wall. But that moment never came. The wall stood firm, meaning the tunnel did not reach close enough underneath the wall. Day 5. The Crusader reinforcement was only a day away. It was now or never. In a desperate attempt, the Muslims ran with buckets of water to put out the fires in the tunnel and dig further underground. The tunnel continued, but would it be finished in time? Day 6. As the sun rays peeked out across the horizon, Muslim soldiers put the explosives at the end of the newly dug tunnel and started the fire. Only a few hours were left before the Crusader reinforcements would arrive. Suddenly, there was a cracking sound, and then came a huge explosion. To the cheers of the Muslims, the stones of the wall shuddered, and the wall collapsed downwards. Finally, a breakthrough. A gap. The Muslims charged forward. The Crusaders gathered around the gap to create a choking point for the Muslims. From behind the infantry, the Muslim archers rained armor-piercing arrows down on the Crusaders. Desperate hand-to-hand combat ensued amidst the rubble and dark clouds of smoke. Inch by inch, the Muslims pushed in. The order was to show no mercy and take no prisoners. The Crusader reinforcement arrived nearby, but seeing the column of smoke from the distance, they lost hope and turned around. The Muslims dealt one final push, and finally the castle was under Muslim control. Saladin's yellow standard was finally flying over the Tower of Jacob's Ford. In the following month, Saladin showed an even broader strategic approach against the Crusaders. He had been working on rebuilding the Egyptian naval force for the last few months, and to show his strength, he launched a naval assault in another important Crusader city named Acre, just weeks after recapturing Jacob's Ford. Although being a shot and run mission, it successfully destroyed the harbor towers and several ships. After decades, Muslims now had a formidable navy. Saladin once again showed how he had learned and improved from every setback in his life. The game had now turned. The Crusaders had lost the upper hand. Saladin now dominated the borders of the Crusader states, both from land and sea. But with all the fighting continuing on the Western Front, a great storm was brewing elsewhere, moving fast to engulf Saladin's empire. The political turmoil returned to Syria, and Reynold of Chatillon decided to attack Medina and kidnap the body of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, in an act of revenge.